All right, good morning. Let's see as we're getting here started. Sorry for the late start this morning. Hope everyone's doing all right this morning. Today, we're going to be doing something a little different than we have been. That is going through a book, a chapter of a book together. The book today that we're going to be going over is a book that I've actually have not finished, but I've gotten through the first 6 chapters of it, and we'll be reading ahead. But the first 6 chapters I liked so much, I thought it would be good to go through together, especially in light of going through piety and the class on piety that we will be resuming next week. I believe I will try to get that ready for us by Monday of next week. We will have a stream tomorrow. We will have a stream on Saturday, but we won't have on Sunday. That will be a consistent thing for obvious reasons. If you are waking up early to watch a stream, you should instead wake up early and go to church. But obviously, with my job, I will be here up early at the church getting ready for church. So we'll be unable to do said stream. That will be the consistent schedule. The habit that I'm going to be trying to maintain and keep myself to is to stream every day before work, Monday through Saturday, and go through different things like this. So this will be exciting, I think. This is by one of my favorite Puritan authors, Thomas Watson. I've read several things by him that I've really enjoyed. His work on the Ten Commandments, his work on the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which really comes across as a systematic theology of sorts. And then also looked into a lot of his work on the Lord's Prayer. So here we are looking at a book that he wrote called Heaven Taken by Storm. Heaven Taken by Storm. Thomas Watson was a Puritan, and I would like to kind of preface how one should approach reading the Puritans. And I think I don't want to put all the Puritans into one box or one category, because the Puritans, there are many Puritans, there are many stripes of Puritans, some that are more extreme, some that are less. My instinct, the more that I've read of the Puritans, my instinct is to recommend more so English Puritans versus American Puritans. And maybe this is me getting a little more or a little less enthusiastic, maybe that's a word to use in my old age, a little less mainstream evangelical, because American Puritanism really is at the root of modern evangelicalism. Now they look very different, but the trajectory is the same, or there's that same trajectory there. American Puritans, the reason why they are so different than the English Puritans in some regards, although they share some common ideas, gets back at what a Puritan is. The English church, the Anglican church, did reform, as in it did protest against the Roman Catholic Church and break away from the Roman Catholic Church. If you recall your history, though, it has had a tenuous relationship, though, with Roman Catholicism. And so that means the Anglican Church kind of has different streams in it, some that look more Reformed and some that look less Reformed and more Catholic. And when Elizabeth ascended the throne and tried to find a kind of middling position, Puritans, this was a byword, they were called, but they kind of adopted it for themselves, were those that wanted to purify the English church. Purify, they said it wasn't pure enough. It hadn't done away with enough Roman Catholic traditions that were not biblical. So you can imagine that if that's really the only category you're looking at, that there are then many Puritans who fall all over the map on how much the English church needs to be purified. Does it need to be purified such that we have no more episcopal form of government, such that we have even no more structural government that holds everything together, maybe like a Presbyterian? Because we have to remember this is going on at the same time that Scotland has reformed and has reformed to a very distinctly Presbyterian form of government and Presbyterian church. So when we talk about Puritans, sometimes people like Samuel Rutherford get called Puritan. I don't think that's quite accurate. Samuel Rutherford was Scottish, and so was firmly Presbyterian. And he, even though he came down to the Westminster Assembly and was interacting with a lot of Puritans who were wanting to reform the church and to purify it, right? But what makes a British Puritan different from an American Puritan? Well, they're both British by race and by nation and culture. However, the Puritans in England were those that were fighting to purify and to reform the Church of England. And the American ones were those that had fled England and had gone over to the colonies because they could no longer either stand worshiping in the Anglican Church as it stood in England at the time, or they had begun to create what were called independent churches. And these independent churches had no ties to the Anglican Church whatsoever. And that was illegal to do in the nation of England. Really illegal to do in any European nation at that time, except the Netherlands, where there was kind of some freedom there. And so if you're familiar with William Bradford and the Pilgrim's Plantation that he wrote about his journey on the Mayflower, he talks about their time over in the Netherlands where they sought refuge. And so that then brings a very different stripe of theology to either one. One is actively fighting for a church in England and trying to purify it, and one has given up on said cause. And so I think you will see a difference there. So there's a world of difference between someone like a Thomas Watson or a John Owen and someone like a Jonathan Edwards. And so I do tend to think that the English Puritans were a little bit more measured and a little less extreme in their calculations. All that to be said, one thing that I would still warn us to watch out for in the Puritan stream of thought is even though they rightly see the problem in many of the higher Anglo-Catholic strands of theology that emphasizes the forms, and I talked about this a little bit yesterday, emphasizes the forms like the things you do externally, so in piety, going to church, and trusting in them to a point where you cease to think that you need to be earnest or sincere in your faith. They rightly identified this problem, and yet some of them begin to emphasize more and more and more the need for that sincerity, the need to be born again and feel that or know when you felt that. And it begins to emphasize more of the feelings associated with faith. And as it begins to reject, or at least hold as suspect, those external things that one does that are associated with faith. And so one could see how that would be a big problem, because that begins to lend itself toward what will be known as an enthusiast strand, or that's what at least it's called on the continent in German circles. The enthusiasts were the ones that said, I know all these external things happen in the church, but they don't really matter for much. It's really what is your feeling on the matter? Are you sincere? Were you really born again? And that question being asked is not really asking, are you just are you born again? It is, did you feel that, and can you name the day? And can you, so you can see how that strand is even more present in the American context, which eventually turned into the first and then the second Great Awakening, in which the feelings were utterly important, and people were redevoting their life to Christ, because they didn't remember a time when they felt this rebirth, this born again day. And you can see in the modern American context how that has still affected the church, right? Many people will remember that day that they committed their life to Christ, that they were born again, and they will look back at that day, and you can see where this really begins to create the same problem that the Anglo-Catholic strand perhaps had a problem with as well, where an Anglo-Catholic would look at maybe the fact that he was baptized and say, I'm baptized, therefore I'm good to go. And then they would still live a heathen life of vice and ill repute, and not worry because he had been baptized that day, so he's good to go. So too does that then the enthusiast side of things evolve to such a point that people say, well, I was born again on this day. I remember what I felt. I remember that spiritual feeling that bubbled up in me when I committed my life to Christ. And so even if they're living a life of vice or ill repute, they say, well, don't worry. I remember that day. That was the day that I was born again. And so you see how it can lend to a problem either way, right? So I wanted to bring that as a preface. I hate to bring such a caveat that would cast doubt on the Puritans so much that you might be tempted to cast doubt on Watson in his book here. But I bring the caveat first, but I do want to say what the Puritans really are excellent at. And that is that even though maybe they have this more enthusiast strand, or some of them do, that's why I want to caveat that as well. There are many Puritans that don't have such an enthusiast strain. What they really shine at is their devotion and their piety. So though their enthusiasm evolved into something that I just mentioned that we really see become a huge problem in the Second Great Awakening, the Puritans themselves, though emphasizing such sincerity, did emphasize the need to strive in the Christian life toward vice, or toward virtue and against vice, and toward piety and acts of piety. And this book is a prime example of that. And they really get into the practicalities of it. They are intensely biblical in the way that they approach that. And they are very approachable in many ways. Some of them are harder to read, like a John Owen, who is kind of known as the academic amongst the Puritans. But many of them are writing books that are meant for the layman, meant for their parishioners, as they are considering those that they're preaching to and pastoring. And so they're very practical in that sense. How is it that one approaches the pious life? And emphasizing too, not just the externals, but the sincerity that one must have in approaching these, which is important, right? So I want us to realize the kind of golden mean between these two things. If there is, let me bring up our whiteboard. If there is, let's see if it's, I don't know why it's dark there at the bottom. That's all right. But if on one side we have, I'll call it the externals, or we could call it externalism. If on one side this error is placing so much stock in and having so much faith in the externals, the things that one does physically, which are not unimportant, then the other side, the enthusiasm, is placing so much stock in the feelings and what you feel in the internal man. And we ought to find some kind of golden mean, to use the Aristotelian, between these two things. that this can become an error, and this can become an error. And we want to find the middle ground here. And so there are many Puritans, I think, that actually do find that middle ground. And they are warring against this externalism that is a problem in England. And yet what maybe our day and age now is dealing with this and needs to be taught that externals do actually help. And when you do certain things that seem maybe like silly forms that, well, it doesn't matter if I kneel at prayer, right? If I actually physically kneel down on my knees, God will hear my prayer either way. So it doesn't matter. It really matters if I have a sincere prayer, right? So I don't care if I kneel. Well, yes. However, kneeling does have an effect on you. It does cause you to think through, or to really feel the humility that one ought to have when approaching a holy God, right? And if you're praying for a sustained amount of time, it begins to be a little uncomfortable, which is good, right? It causes you to be active in the prayer, not fall asleep, right? It causes you to realize the activity that one must have in prayer. And so that external is not irrelevant, right? It is good. And yet, if you kneel in your prayer and yet you're never sincere and you never really are coming in faith to God in prayer, and you just say the words that you have memorized and you kneel and you say, well, I knelt at prayer and I said the right words. Look how pious I am. I must be a really pious man. And see how that then is a problem as well, right? So we want to find that golden mean. Let's look at Heaven Taken by Storm. I have also conveniently picked a book that I can read online without any copyright strikes because it is in the public domain, which is great for this channel because I love reading old dead guys who I can read as long as I would like on YouTube and have no problems. All right, this is Heaven Taken by Storm. And why did he call it this? Because he is really speaking to the fact that piety, the Christian life, and the journey that we're on, it is something that has to be done very actively. It is not a passive affair. It's not something you can just sit back and let happen to you. It's something that you must be actively and vigorously engaged in. So let's begin with Mr. Watson's treatment on this. Chapter 1, Taking the Kingdom of Heaven by Holy Violence. The kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. Matthew 11:12. John the Baptist, hearing in prison of the fame of Christ, sends 2 of his disciples to him with this question: Art thou he that should come, or do we look for another? Not as Tertullian thinks, that John the Baptist knew not that Jesus Christ was the true Messiah, for he was confirmed in this both by the Spirit of God and by a sign from heaven. But John the Baptist hereby endeavored to correct the ignorance of his own disciples, who had a greater respect for him than for Christ. So he's opening up, really expositing this one verse. This is very common in Puritan works, that all of their chapters are kind of mini sermons, right? They will really be expositing a single verse and really trying to get at what it's saying. And so this is a verse right after these disciples of John come to Christ, and this is his response. This verse I've read over so many times and not really gotten at. What does the Lord mean? That the kingdom of heaven will suffer violence, and that the violent will take it by force. He goes on. In the 4th verse, Christ answers their question. Go and shew John again those things which ye do hear and see, and the blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, etc. Jesus Christ demonstrates himself to be the true Messiah by his miracles, which were real and ocular proofs of his divinity. John's disciples being departed, Christ falls into a high praise and condemnation of John the Baptist. What were ye out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken with the wind? As if Christ had said John the Baptist was no unconstant man, fluctuating in his mind and being shaken as a reed from one opinion to another. He was no Reuben, unstable as water, but was fixed and resolute in religion, and a prison could make no alteration in him. But what went he out for to see? A man clothed in soft raiment? John did not indulge his senses. He wore not silks, but camel's hair, nor did he affect to live at court, but in a wilderness. So as we preface Jesus' words here, he begins by praising John, right? Which goes to Watson's point that John was not sending his disciples to ask this question because he doubted that Jesus was the Messiah. John believed that Jesus was the Messiah. John is the one that said, "Why do you ask that I baptize you? I'm not worthy of this. You should be baptizing me." And John, of course, leapt in the very womb of his mother for joy at being so close to the presence of his Savior. And so we know this is not really doubts in John's mind, but he's sending his disciples there, probably knowing that his death is imminent, and these disciples ought to follow the true Messiah, and he sends them his way. Again, Christ commends John as being his forerunner, who prepared the way before him. He was the morning star, which did precede the Son of Righteousness, and that Christ might sufficiently honor this holy man, he does not only parallel him with, but prefers him before the chief of the prophets. Went ye out to see a prophet? Yea, I say unto you, and more than a prophet. Among them that are born of women, there hath not arisen a greater than John the Baptist. He was eminent both for dignity of office and perspicuity of doctrine. And so our text is ushered in. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. So here we get to the verse in question, as Jesus continues to praise John the Baptist, calling him greater than the prophets, right? Quite an astounding statement. The prophets would have been the most revered fathers of old for the Jews to look back on at this time. But John the Baptist is greater than all of them, Christ says. In these words, there is first the preface or introduction from the days of John the Baptist until now. John the Baptist was a zealous preacher, a Boanerges, a son of thunder, and after his preaching, people began to be awakened out of their sins. Hence, learn what kind of ministry is likely to do the most good, namely, that which works upon the conscience of men. John the Baptist lifted up his voice like a trumpet. He preached the doctrine of repentance with power. Repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, Matthew 3:2. He came hewing and cutting down men's sins, and afterwards preached Christ to them. So this is very important that he's going to make this point of what preaching should look like. And maybe this is something to consider if you are indeed a preacher, or if you are thinking, if you are searching for a church and listening to the preachers at those churches at which you are searching, right? What is it that they hear like, or that they sound like? Are they preaching with vigor and saying, repent, right, and turn to Christ? Or are they tickling the ears, as Paul would talk about in his pastoral epistles, especially that to Timothy? That there are preachers that come along and they just say all the things you want to hear? Or are they saying, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, right? So that Jesus Christ has come, and turn to him. If you do not turn to him, there is no salvation. And John was a prime example of this. He was not a soft man, as Jesus said. He was not one who wore silks and hung out in palaces. This was a man's man who lived on the land, who wore camel skin, and people came to him not because of his refinement, but because of the strength with which he preached and the message that he preached. First, Watson goes on, he poured in the vinegar of the law, then the wine of the gospel. This was the preaching which made men studiously seek after heaven. John did not so much preach to please as to profit. He chose rather to discover men's sins than to show them his own eloquence. The best mirror is not that which is most gilded, but that which shows the truest face. That preaching is to be preferred, which makes the truest discovery of men's sins and shows them their hearts. John the Baptist was a burning and shining light. He did burn in his doctrine and shine in his life, and therefore men pressed into heaven. That's very important there, right? He burned in his doctrine and he shone in his life. That is, the teaching that he said burned because it was true. It was true teaching, but that was also bolstered by the fact that his life shone forth as he was a virtuous man. How important is it for preachers to be virtuous? Very, very important. Just because a man says the right words, but if he lives a terrible, horrid life, that does damage to the very words he says, right? Which is why it's so important and so dangerous for people to be teachers. And James talks about this. Not everyone should be teachers for this very reason. Peter, who was filled with a spirit of zeal, humbled his hearers for their sins and opened to them a fountain in Christ's blood. They were pricked in the heart, Acts 2:37 says. It is the greatest mercy to have a soul-searching ministry if one If one had a desperate wound, he would desire to have it searched to the bottom. Who would not be content to have their souls searched so that they may have them saved? Secondly, there is the matter in the text. The kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. So here we come to the text at hand, really the central text. What is meant by the kingdom of heaven? Some interpret it as the doctrine of the gospel, which reveals Christ in heaven. So Erasmus taught, but I rather, by the kingdom of heaven, understand glory. So taught Beza and others. So these are two men of the Reformation, Erasmus and Beza. Erasmus, he was not a reformer. He was a halfway reformer. He thought the church needed reform, but he was not willing to go so far as Luther. So in the beginning of his life was actually, he actually did many things that Luther took and ran with. He was a preeminent scholar. But the end of his life, he actually got into many debates with Luther, and you can read that in the Bondage of the Will. You should probably read also Erasmus's initial work. He wrote several treatises on the freedom of the will, which Luther is responding to, and then he actually has another response. But this caused him to not be liked in either circle, for he had said things that sowed doubt about the papacy and about all the things that Rome was fighting for. But now he was saying things that sowed doubt in the Reformed camp, in the Protestant camp. And so he actually died alone because he had really angered both sides. This is that Erasmus, brilliant thinker. I mean, he was smarter than Luther, although he was not as perhaps engaged in the fight as Luther. And Luther saw that, and that was why Luther began to lose respect for him. He wasn't fighting in the fight. Beza is a reformer. He's a second generation, really third generation reformer. He is a protege of Calvin, and he takes what Calvin says and continues to preach it and continue that work there in Geneva. And so they both have different ideas about what the kingdom is. What is the kingdom of heaven? Some think it's the doctrine of the gospel which reveals Christ in heaven. So the kingdom is merely the gospel, the teaching of the gospel. Others, and this is what Beza says, and this is now what Watson's going to agree with, understand glory. It's a very simple way of defining it. The kingdom of heaven is glory. So we'll have to unpack that. So let's go on. This kingdom suffereth violence. It is a metaphor from a town or castle that holds out in war and is not taken but by storm. So the kingdom of heaven will not be taken without violence. The violent take it by force. The earth is inherited by the meek, Matthew 5:5. Heaven is inherited by the violent. Our life is military. Christ is our captain. The gospel is the banner. The graces are our spiritual artillery. In heaven is only taken in a forcible way. These words fall into two parts. So this is the metaphor he's going to now run with. That the kingdom of heaven is taken by force. This is not the kingdom of heaven playing a defensive role as though there are enemy forces that are trying to take it against the will of heaven, against the will of God. No, that's not what he's saying. He is saying that those who are engaged in the Christian life, heading toward heaven, it is violent, the acts that they do, in a sense. This is a metaphorical violence. This is not a real violence. But it is so active, it is so engaged that it seems like violence. It seems like we are soldiers marching forward militantly, and those that make it, that are going to get into heaven, are those that are engaged militarily, he says. And Christ is our captain, he says. So what are these two parts that it falls under to? He says, number one, the combat, and he points to the fact that it's suffering violence here. Number one, the combat. And number two, the conquest, for the violent take it by force. The right way to take heaven is by storm, or thus none get into heaven but violent ones. This violence has a double aspect. First, it concerns men as magistrates. They must be violent in punishing the guilty. When Aaron's Urim and Thummim will do no good, then must Moses come with his rod. The wicked are the bad people and surfeits of the commonwealth, which by the care of the magistracy are to be purged out. God has placed governors for the terror of evildoers. They must not be like the swordfish, which has a sword in his head, but is without a heart. They must not have a sword in their hand, but no heart to draw it out for the cutting down of impiety. Connivance in a magistrate supports vice, and by not punishing offenders, he adopts other men's faults and makes them his own. Magistracy without zeal is like the body without spirit. Too much leniency emboldens sin, and doth but shave the head, which deserves to be cut off. This is an important paragraph that maybe our modern ears don't like to hear, but he makes a very valid point. He wants to say, what does this violence look like? Well, in some ways, it does actually look like violence if we look at what the duty of a magistrate is. What is the magistrate? Someone who is called upon to rule a particular aspect of the commonwealth, a city, a town, a state, a nation, etc. And what happens if they don't use violence against the wicked in their land, in their realm? Well, he's saying the violence not done to the evildoer is acceptance of the evildoer, is acceptance of evil, is acceptance of the things that they bring into that society. This is as moderns, we like to pretend like we're so virtuous when we have such great sympathy on those that are doing crimes and being evil within the Commonwealth, and yet, and I say Commonwealth, our nation, right? And yet, love for wickedness is hate for righteousness, right? And we see how that has played out when we become more and more and more lenient upon crimes being committed in our nation. We are really doing injustice and violence to those that are the victims of said crime, right? If you don't punish someone who is a murderer, what are you doing? You're punishing the victims of said murderer by not allowing justice to reign here. That is not to say there's not a place for mercy, and not to say that Watson wouldn't think there's a place for mercy. There most certainly is. But he wants to make this point emphatically, that, and he's almost saying this as an example because this is something that his audience would have understood very well. Of course, a magistrate has to do this, right? And now we're going to talk about this in the spiritual sense and how this works itself out in the Christian life. But let's go on. Let's see. Will we get through chapter 1? We are already at 9 o'clock. We have many more pages. We might be finishing halfway through chapter 1 and come back to chapter 1 tomorrow. That's all right. He goes on. In defending the innocent, the magistrate is the asylum or altar of refuge for the oppressed to fly to. Charles, Duke of Calabria, was so in love with doing justice that he caused a bell to be hung at his palace gate, and whosoever would ring it was sure presently to be admitted into the Duke's presence, or have some officer sent out to hear his cause. Aristides was famous for his justice, of whom the historian saith that he would never favor any man's cause because he was his friend, nor do injustice to any because he was his enemy. The magistrate's balance is the oppressed man's shield. So here we see really the positive outworking of the magistrate doing good, doing well in his kingdom. How little we prize in our own age, wanting the man who is to rule us to love justice, to really and truly love justice. One of the examples he just gave here is from a pre-Christian world, Aristides. And yet they even understood this, right? We don't think of it this way anymore. We just see two political parties and certain pillars of those parties that we just want this to get voted in here and there. And politics has become very devoid of any kind of ethic or standard or any kind of transcendental idea. There's nothing religious about it anymore. It's all just practicality and getting what you want here and there. But even this pre-Christian, this man who lived in a place without Christ and without the revelation of God, is saying, no, what makes a good magistrate? One who loves justice. I think that should be obvious to us, and unfortunately it's not anymore. We'll go on. Let's see. We're at page 4 of 8. Actually, this might be a good place to stop. There's one more paragraph. Let me read this paragraph, and then we'll move on next time. Secondly, the violence concerns men as Christians. Though heaven be given us freely, yet we must contend for it. Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might. Our work is great, our time short, our master urgent. We have need, therefore, to summon together all the powers of our souls and strive as in a matter of life and death, that we may arrive at the kingdom above. We must not only put forth diligence, but violence. For the illustrating and clearing of this proposition, I shall show that violence is not meant. What violence is not meant here. So he's going to go on to talk about what he means by violence, and that's what we'll get in tomorrow. But he applies this verse from Ecclesiastes 9:10, Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might. We might even say, do it with all thy might, right? And so I want us to end there. Let me mark our page here for us so we can know where to start tomorrow. But hear what he's saying there. Whatever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might. Don't do it half-heartedly or haphazardly. Do it with all thy might. And how is that not most true in matters spiritual instead of matters physical? If you take a job, you should do it with all thy might, right? You should do it not haphazardly, but do it with diligence. If you are going to go and help someone who needs help, you shouldn't just do it haphazardly, but you should do it earnestly, sincerely. But if we are to do religion, that is, if we are to be Christians, if we are to walk the life and follow after Christ, as he has so commanded, are we not to do that with all sincerity? Are we not to do that in this way that he's going to call violence because it looks so military-like? In the same way, right, that a man in the military has to be trained in order to execute those things that the general has them do in the battlefield, right? Do we not take the same approach? Ought we not take the same approach? It was another Puritan that said that the one who invests so much time in the physical reality, even in good things, we're talking about good things, but doesn't do anything spiritually. He tends to his body so well, but he doesn't tend to his soul. It is like a man who feeds his dog and stars his son. That, I think, unfortunately, is really the one of the biggest vices of Americans today. I think most Americans will not see the pearly gates, not because they are militant atheists, but because of the subtle sin of apathy. They just don't care. I don't think that most people are not in church because they have all these grand arguments against church. I think they're not in church just because they wake up on a Sunday and they've just either not been taught to, or they have ceased to care. It's Sunday. It's a day off. I'm just going to go and do my own thing. We can't be like that. If we are going to be Christians, we should be Christians. We should follow Christ. We should believe the gospel. We should seek to obey the commands that Christ gave, for he said, if you love me, you will keep my commands. And not doing this, right? I always feel like I need to make this caveat because I live in evangelical circles, but it's not like we're so fighting against Rome that we have to always make this caveat. Of course, we're not buying heaven by our deeds. It's not as though this is a transactional thing. It's not as though this is works-based theology. But I shouldn't always have to say that. Watson doesn't even feel the need to say that in this work. That's presumed. Yes, the gospel is true. You need to be earnest in the following of what Christ has told you to do. You need to be sincere in it. You need to strive for it. You need to fight for it like a soldier fights for his general. I mean, Paul even makes that analogy, right? And so that's what this book is about. Heaven taken by storm. We're going to continue to go through this book, and I hope it will be of benefit to you. And we will read the whole thing on the stream, so that'll be fun. And I'll just be commenting throughout as we make our way through the book, and I'll maybe try to explain anything that might be difficult to understand. I'm not going to translate it into modern vernacular. I'll just explain things as we come along them. Maybe just because I also just like the these and thous. I like reading Old English works. So hope you can join us tomorrow morning. I will be here around 8 o'clock, just as usual. But until then, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you, be gracious to you. The Lord lift his countenance upon you and bring you peace. Amen.